This is the reason 97% of all money in modern economies does not come from government printing presses or central banks. Commercial banks create it, the same institutions where you hold a checking account, and they do it not by printing anything but by approving loans. That finding comes from the Bank of England's landmark 2014 paper, which stated plainly that whenever a bank makes a loan, it simultaneously creates a matching deposit in the borrower's bank account, thereby creating new money. Most people never learn this, and what they think they know about banking turns out to be wrong. The misconception most of us absorbed in school goes something like this. You deposit money in a bank, and the bank lends it to someone else, acting as a middleman between savers and borrowers. That sounds reasonable, but here is the thing. It is not how the system actually operates. The Bank of England addressed this directly when it wrote that, rather than banks receiving deposits when households save and then lending them out, bank lending creates deposits. That sentence deserves a second read because lending creates deposits, not the other way around. What actually happens when your mortgage gets approved looks nothing like the textbook version. The bank does not check its vault or transfer funds from some saver's account. A banker simply credits your account with the loan amount by typing numbers into a computer, and at that precise moment, new money springs into existence. Some economists have called this fountain pen money, created at the stroke of a banker's pen. A 2023 study from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia measured exactly how much of this goes on. 92% of deposits in the U.S. banking system result from bank lending activities, which means only 8% come from people actually depositing cash. Between 2011 and 2020, banks on average created $10.7 trillion per year, a sum equivalent to 57% of GDP generated every single year. Anyone who studied economics probably encountered the money multiplier, where $100 in deposits eventually becomes $1,000 through successive rounds of lending. It is a clean theory, but the Bank of England says it is wrong. Their 2014 paper put it bluntly. The money multiplier theory can be a useful way of introducing money and banking in economic textbooks, but it is not an accurate description of how money is created in reality. And this is where it gets interesting. As of March 26, 2020, the United States has zero reserve requirements because the Federal Reserve eliminated them entirely. The UK has not required reserves since 1981, Canada dropped them in 1992, and Australia abandoned them back in 1988. If the money multiplier actually controlled lending, eliminating reserve requirements would let banks create infinite money. That obviously has not happened because banks face other constraints, including capital requirements under Basel III standards, liquidity rules, and the basic challenge of finding credit-worthy borrowers. The origins of this system trace back to London in the 1630s, when goldsmiths with sturdy vaults began accepting gold deposits from wealthy merchants. Paper receipts served as IOUs, promising that the goldsmith was holding that gold for the depositor. Everything changed in 1640 when King Charles I seized bullion stored at the Tower of London, driving depositors toward private goldsmiths whose vaults suddenly seemed safer than anything controlled by the crown. Over the following decades, goldsmiths stumbled onto a discovery that would reshape finance. Depositors almost never showed up to demand all their gold at once, so the goldsmiths started issuing more receipts than they had gold to back. As long as everyone did not show up simultaneously demanding their metal, the system held together. Fractional reserve banking had been born in those London vaults, and the practice spread to become the foundation of modern finance. The Bank of England opened in 1694, The Federal Reserve was signed into law on December 23, 1913. The European Central Bank was not established until 1998. Throughout all this history, banks still create money when they lend. If commercial banks create most of the money, what do central banks actually do? Central banks create base money, which includes physical currency plus reserve balances that commercial banks hold. This makes up only a small fraction of the total money supply. The Bank of England's numbers show physical currency accounts for just 3%, leaving bank deposits at 97%. Central banks also create money through quantitative easing. The central bank buys government bonds, credits the seller's bank with new deposits, and credits that bank with new reserves. Money gets created at both levels simultaneously. The scale of these programs defies easy comprehension. Before 2008, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet stood at around $870 billion. That number peaked at $9 trillion in 2022. The Bank of England's holdings reached £895 billion, and the European Central Bank's programs totaled €4.3 trillion. Not everyone thinks this system represents good design. Austrian school economists like Murray Rothbard viewed fractional reserve banking as fundamentally fraudulent. They wrote that fractional reserve banks create money out of thin air, essentially doing it the same way as counterfeiters. Their analysis holds that credit expansion causes bad investments and inevitably leads to boom and bust cycles. Economist Irving Fisher proposed an alternative in the 1930s called the Chicago Plan, where banks would hold 100% reserves and only central banks would create money. An IMF study in 2012 modeled Fisher's proposal and found support for his claimed benefits, including potential output gains of 10%. Modern monetary theory takes a completely different view. Economist Stephanie Kelton argues that currency-issuing governments can always create money to fund spending, and the real constraint is not running out of money, but inflation. Critics point to what happened after 2020 as evidence against this, when M2 money supply jumped 42% between February 2020 and February 2022, followed by inflation peaking at 9%. The system continues to evolve. 137 countries representing 98% of global GDP are now exploring central bank digital currencies. The Bahamas launched the first modern retail central bank digital currency in October 2020, and China has been piloting its digital yuan since 2019. These currencies could eventually transform who creates money, with some proposals shifting that power entirely to central banks. Every piece of this connects back to one simple fact. When you pay for groceries, buy a house, or check your bank balance, you are interacting with money that commercial banks created through lending. No government printed it, and no gold backs it. Bookkeeping entries brought it into existence when someone decided to borrow. The Bank of England put it plainly: most of the money in circulation is created, not by the printing presses of the Bank of England, but by the commercial banks themselves. This has been true since London goldsmiths discovered they could issue more receipts than the gold they actually held. The scale has grown from small vaults to a global system creating trillions annually, but the mechanism remains unchanged. 97% of the money in modern economies gets created by commercial banks, out of thin air, every time they approve a loan. Now you know how it works.